So you're just starting out photography and you're wondering to yourself, man, how do I really step up my game, or how do I get better photos? Well, I'm going to basically go over and teach you what I used and what I think is probably the fastest way on how you can quickly improve your photography. Hey guys, so for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Daniel. I'm a photographer and videographer based in Thailand, and yeah, I do photos and video for a living basically. So today I'm going to be going over what I think is definitely the fastest way, or one of the best ways kind of to learn the basics of photography and especially get to know your camera really well. When you're just starting out photography, it's definitely very hard, and there's a lot of new concepts, especially regarding stuff like light, exposure, aperture, all these kind of words that you've maybe never heard of before. So it's definitely very, very overwhelming. So for me personally, what I think is the best and fastest way to step up your photography game is to really learn and understand your camera. And what I mean by this is understanding stuff like what does the ISO do? What does the aperture do? How shutter speed works? And really being able to understand how to dial in these settings for your camera. Now, most cameras are going to be the same or generally very similar, right? But obviously you have stuff like native ISO, understanding the limits of your camera and being able to operate your camera really quickly, understanding the menus, understanding what all that overwhelming information actually does and what it means. I won't go into too much detail because there's a bunch of different cameras and they all have different menu systems and stuff like that. But in general, to get started with photography, you've got to understand the big three, which is essentially your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. I'll briefly go over them, but if you really want to understand this stuff very thoroughly, I just recommend you go on YouTube or Google, because there's definitely like 100 more people who can explain this much better than I can. So the first thing, ISO, is basically how sensitive your camera is to light. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is, but you sacrifice a bit of clarity and you introduce a lot more noise and grain into your photos. This is definitely kind of like the last thing you want to change, but just remember, less ISO is a darker image, more ISO is a brighter image, but less clear or more fuzzy. So aperture basically determines how much light is physically let onto your lens. What it means is there are these metal blades that are inside of your lens, and the wider your aperture is, the wider the hole in your lens is, or the wider apart these blades are, so more light can come onto your sensor, meaning that you get a brighter image, but you get more bokeh or a more blurry background, right? So just remember, a lower aperture number, so like f1, f2, those are very nice and blurry backgrounds, and a higher aperture number, so like f8, you're gonna have everything in focus, but it lets in less light. So now the final thing, we got shutter speed. Shutter speed basically determines how long your shutter is open for. So this is kind of a little bit hard to explain. You really got to experiment with this. So the longer you have your shutter open for, the more it captures movement. So imagine that if I have the shutter open for 1/1 second, that means that everything that happens or everything that moves within 1 second is going to be captured. So if you have a higher shutter speed, so like 1/600, that means that it's going to only capture 1/600th of a second. And obviously there's not going to be a lot of movement there unless you got something moving really fast. So your image is going to be sharp. So you just got to remember that basically a higher shutter speed means more sharp or less movement in your photo, and a lower shutter speed means there's a lot more movement in your photo. So how do you learn these things really quickly? Well, I think, or I personally believe in experience. I think that's the best way. If you're someone who doesn't learn that well from experience, or you think you prefer researching and watching videos and stuff like that, then go ahead. That's your thing. But I personally believe, or at least for me, it works very well when I actually physically get to go out and do things and try things. I think that's the best way to learn, in my opinion. So how do you learn all these things? Well, I personally believe in learning by experience. If you want to do research and you learn better by studying or doing stuff like theory, watching videos, then all the power to you. But I personally believe, and I think with something like this where you have to physically use something, it's definitely better to have hands-on experience. So how do you go around doing this? I definitely recommend street photography. Not only is it really easy for you to just go out whenever, you got hours of the day, so the lighting is different all throughout the day. You kind of get to understand lighting naturally. You have to use ambient lighting. You know, you can't just turn off the sun or change the brightness of the sun. So that really forces yourself to kind of think, all right, how can I position myself? How can I set up my shot so that the lighting looks good? You've also got composition. You got to think about, all right, you need to be actively looking and searching for subjects, right? Do I want to shoot this person sitting at a bus stop, or do I want to shoot this car driving by, or maybe this building? So you've got to really push your kind of imagination and creativity to the next level, I believe, because not to bash against other types of genres of photography, you know, for example, doing portraits and stuff like that. But I think that when you're doing something like a portrait shoot, you kind of come into it thinking, all right, this is my subject, and you kind of get you kind of start to bottleneck or be a little bit narrow-minded or tunnel vision on what kind of photos you want to get. So I feel like when you're doing street photography, you really have like no limit, or I feel like you restrict yourself less to kind of compositions and subjects. Shutter speed is also something you're going to have to learn how to kind of gauge what shutter speed works. Same with ISO. You know, all these settings are very, very dependent on your situation and where you are, what you're shooting. So, you know, I feel like putting yourself in a street photography situation really, really forces you to think quick and act quick. Now, obviously, you can help yourself by maybe putting your camera in aperture priority mode. So this prioritizes the aperture and the camera takes care of the shutter speed and ISO. Or maybe you want to be in shutter speed priority mode, so you control the shutter speed. And doing these kind of small steps or baby steps really helps you understand. So you don't have to think about, oh, is my aperture okay? Is the ISO okay? Usually you just set your camera to the correct exposure you want with a little exposure dial, and then you just focus on one or two settings at a time. I would recommend starting out with maybe aperture or shutter speed. I would lean more towards the shutter speed because that's something that you kind of need to get an understanding for and feel for, so you can do stuff like really cool panning shots, or you need to kind of gauge, all right, this subject is moving at this speed, what shutter speed do I need? So once you've gotten a little bit more hands-on experience and maybe you're a little bit more confident, I definitely suggest stepping up to manual, because you're now in full control of the camera and you have to control and change all the settings constantly. And the more you do it, the more efficient you're going to get. And I just feel like it's kind of building that muscle memory, all right? So if you can see on your camera preview, all right, it's looking a little bit dark, you instantly know, your brain's, all right, okay, either I got to do shutter speed or ISO, you know. You can remember what ISO you're at, and you're like, okay, nope, I can't go that much higher because I'm going to get too much noise. Let's maybe lower the shutter speed. Or if you're already at a too low shutter speed, you're like, okay, aperture. So you start to get into a habit and really build up this muscle memory so that you don't have to think and you don't stutter, because your brain's already instantly like, okay, you know, we need to do this and that to get a great shot. So definitely recommend shooting in manual when possible. Obviously, it's not like shooting in manual is going to elevate you to the next level. I just feel like it really helps you to kind of understand. Obviously, I like to shoot sometimes in aperture priority or shutter speed priority, depending on the situation. I prefer more to manual, but I can definitely see why people like to shoot in aperture or shutter speed priority, because it just eliminates a little bit of fidgeting. So yeah, don't be afraid. Don't think that you have to shoot on manual, but I personally recommend, if you can, at least try it out. It will really help you kind of understand your camera, and you'll become very efficient at taking photos. So how many hours would I recommend you spend? Well, I mean, that's pretty much dependent on you and how quickly you learn. You know, some people learn really fast, some people take a longer time. You know, that's completely up to you. You got to work at your own pace. I would typically shoot maybe 4 or 5 hours of street photography every weekend for a couple of months before I think I got pretty confident and I really understood my camera, and I was able to change settings like just super quickly on the fly. I knew how much to change my shutter speed by. I know how to get pretty much sharp and in focus photos all the time. So yeah, definitely recommend just going and shooting at street photography as much as possible. I understand that maybe you might not be into that genre, but the reason why I recommend it is because that lack of control, and also it's very easy to kind of just go out and do it. You know, I feel like if you're shooting portrait or landscape, you kind of have to go somewhere and you got to meet people, whether that's planning, and, you know, if someone cancels or someone can't come, or, you know, maybe the weather's bad or something like that, you might not be as inclined to go. So I feel like it's a lot easier to just be like, all right, I'm just going to shoot street photography today. You know, I feel like you don't really know what you're expecting, so you just kind of go out, and again, it goes back to what I said before. You really got to force yourself to be creative and find these new kind of interesting compositions, because you don't know what you're shooting today. All you know is it's going to be something that's on the street. So yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. I mean, I don't really have anything else to say. That's just it, you know. I'd recommend, so just to all right. So yeah, I think that about covers it. I'm just going to recap real quick. So, you know, learn your 3 basic things: ISO, aperture, shutter speed. Go out and do tons of hands-on photography. Go out and shooting. I mean, you could even try to find someone else you know who does photography, or maybe there's someone local, and you could just ask like, hey, do you mind if you teach me a little bit or something like that? It definitely helps to have someone who knows what they're doing. But if you can't, just go out, shoot. The more you shoot, the better you're going to get. You know, even if you go out and you shoot and you're not happy with the photos, you still at least gone out, took some photos, and, you know, just doing that already helps increase your skill level and, you know, your understanding of how a camera works and how to take better photos. So don't be afraid. If you liked the video, please leave a like, subscribe, let me know. And yeah, I look forward to giving out more tutorials, tips and tricks, and let me know what you guys like to see.